Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most famous disaster stories ever written, the Plagues of Egypt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's mystery together. Long before historians, archaeologists, and scientists started arguing about environmental disasters and ancient climate events, there was simply the story, and it is not a subtle one. The 10 plagues of Egypt appear in the book of Exodus and form one of the most dramatic sequences in the entire Bible. Even people who have never opened the text usually know at least a few of the highlights. Rivers turning to blood, frogs absolutely everywhere, swarms of insects, livestock dying, a sky that suddenly goes dark for 3 days, and finally a mysterious final plague that convinces Pharaoh that maybe keeping millions of angry slaves was not the best management strategy. According to the biblical narrative, it all begins when Moses confronts Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, with a fairly straightforward request. Let the Israelites go. Pharaoh refuses, which according to the story, turns out to be a spectacularly bad decision, because what follows is essentially a series of escalating disasters that make Egypt look less like the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, and more like the setting of a very unfortunate nature documentary. First, the Nile turns to blood. Now, the Nile was not just a river to the Egyptians, it was the entire foundation of their civilization. It provided water, irrigation, transportation, fish, trade routes, and probably most of their daily patience. So when that river suddenly becomes undrinkable and full of dead fish, things go downhill very quickly. Then come the frogs. Lots of frogs. The text describes them appearing everywhere. Houses, kitchens, bedrooms, ovens. Which means the ancient Egyptians briefly experienced something similar to a biblical version of a plumbing disaster. Once the frogs die, things get worse because now you have rotting animals everywhere, which attracts insects. Swarms of gnats and flies appear, livestock begin dying, and people develop painful boils. Then the sky decides to get involved. A violent hailstorm destroys crops. Locusts arrive to eat whatever survived the hail. And at one point, the land is covered in darkness for 3 days. At this stage, Egypt is essentially dealing with the ancient equivalent of a cascading environmental meltdown. And then comes the final plague, the death of the firstborn. It is the moment that finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance and leads to the Exodus. For thousands of years, believers have read this story as divine intervention. But modern historians and scientists sometimes look at it and think something slightly different. That is an awful lot of disasters occurring in a very suspicious sequence, and that raises a curious possibility. What if the story is remembering real events, not miracles necessarily, but a chain reaction of catastrophes that ancient people tried to explain the only way they could? Now, here is where historians run into their first problem. The story of the plagues is incredibly famous. But finding historical evidence for it is complicated, because when people imagine ancient Egypt, they often picture a civilization that recorded everything. Temples covered in hieroglyphs, papyrus scrolls filled with detailed accounts of kings, battles, and daily life. And that image is mostly accurate. Ancient Egypt produced a massive amount of written material. Pharaohs loved documenting their victories, their building projects, and the many ways the gods clearly approved of their leadership. What they did not enjoy documenting was failure, or disasters, or national embarrassment. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions were not written as objective history. They were royal propaganda. Their purpose was to glorify the pharaoh and demonstrate that Egypt was stable, prosperous, and favored by the gods. Which means if something truly catastrophic happened, it probably would not appear on temple walls. Imagine a modern government proudly publishing an official monument that says, "In the 10th year of Pharaoh's reign, the river turned into a biological nightmare. Frogs invaded every kitchen, insects filled the air, crops were destroyed, and then everyone panicked." That monument probably would not make it past the approval committee. So historians face a strange situation. If the plagues were purely religious storytelling, we would not expect to find evidence. But if something like them actually happened, Egypt might still have chosen not to record it. That means researchers have to look in unusual places, indirect evidence, environmental clues, and sometimes those memories appear in strange ways within ancient texts. The real question is not whether the papyrus proves the Exodus story. It does not. The real question is something slightly more subtle. Could stories like the plagues have grown from memories of real catastrophes that ancient people struggled to explain? Because when natural disasters strike ancient societies, they rarely get recorded as calm scientific observations. They get recorded as stories, and those stories often survive far longer than the disasters themselves. If historians try to look for natural explanations behind the plagues, the first place they usually start is with the Nile. Because if something went wrong with the Nile, everything in Egypt would go wrong immediately afterward. Ancient Egyptian civilization depended on that river more than almost any other society depended on a single natural resource. The Nile provided water, irrigation for crops, transportation routes, fish for food, and the annual flooding that made agriculture possible. If the Nile failed, Egypt failed. So, when the Book of Exodus begins its list of plagues with the Nile turning to blood, scientists immediately start asking, what kind of environmental event could produce something like that? Now, to be clear, no river literally turns into blood. If that happened today, scientists would be less concerned with algae and more concerned with the apocalypse. But rivers can turn red. One possible explanation is something called a harmful algal bloom. Certain microorganisms can multiply rapidly under the right environmental conditions, especially when water becomes warmer or contaminated with nutrients. Some species produce pigments that turn the water deep red or reddish-brown, and many of them produce toxins. When these blooms occur, fish die in huge numbers because the water becomes depleted of oxygen. The river can become foul-smelling, undrinkable, and dangerous for animals and humans alike. To ancient observers, the effect would have been terrifying. Imagine waking up to find that the river your entire civilization depends on has suddenly changed color. Fish are floating dead along the banks, and the water smells so bad, no one wants to drink it. You might not immediately think a lol bloom. You might think something far more dramatic. And if the Nile became polluted or toxic, it would trigger a cascade of consequences across the ecosystem. Fish would die, animals that lived in the water would flee, and suddenly creatures that normally stayed hidden inside the river would begin appearing everywhere else, which leads directly to the second plague, the frogs. And once frogs start fleeing the river in massive numbers, the entire chain reaction of environmental chaos might already be underway. Because ecosystems have a habit of collapsing in very inconvenient ways, especially when their main river suddenly stops cooperating. If the Nile really did become polluted or toxic for some reason, the next plague described in Exodus suddenly starts to make a surprising amount of sense. Frogs. A lot of frogs. According to the biblical account, frogs poured out of the river and spread across the land. They filled homes, kitchens, ovens, and sleeping areas. Basically, anywhere an ancient Egyptian might reasonably expect not to find frogs. There were frogs, which must have made daily life extremely awkward. But amphibians behave in very predictable ways when their environment becomes dangerous. Frogs spend most of their lives in or near water. Their skin is highly sensitive to toxins, oxygen levels, and pollution. If the water becomes contaminated, they are often among the first creatures to abandon it. So if something made the Nile suddenly toxic, frogs would not politely stay where they were. They would leave quickly, and they would leave in enormous numbers. Modern ecological disasters sometimes show exactly this behavior. When wetlands or rivers become polluted, amphibians flee the water and spread across nearby land as they search for safer environments. To the people watching this happen in ancient Egypt, the result would look like a full-scale frog invasion. But there is another important detail. Frogs do not survive long away from water. So if huge numbers of frogs escape the river and spread across the countryside, many of them would soon begin dying. Which brings us to the next part of the ecological domino effect. Dead animals, and lots of them. Once frogs die in large numbers, their bodies begin decomposing. And decomposition attracts something that ancient people probably disliked even more than frogs: insects. Rotting organic matter is basically an invitation for flies, gnats, and other insects to reproduce rapidly. Their populations can explode in a very short time when food sources suddenly appear everywhere. So, the frog invasion might have been only the beginning. First, the river becomes toxic, then frogs flee the water, then frogs die across the land. And suddenly, Egypt is dealing with something much worse than amphibians. Because when insect populations explode, they bring more than annoyance. They bring disease. And the next plagues described in Exodus involve exactly that. Swarms of insects filling the air, which suggests that the environmental chain reaction might have already been in full motion. Once large numbers of frogs die across the countryside, the ecological situation begins to change rapidly. Because nature has a very efficient cleanup crew: insects. When organic matter begins decomposing, flies, gnats, mosquitoes, and other insects multiply extremely quickly. Their life cycles are short, which means their populations can explode in just a few days if conditions are right. And if thousands of frogs suddenly died across the Nile Valley, conditions would definitely be right. The book of Exodus describes 2 plagues that involve insects. First comes lice or gnats, then come swarms of flies. To ancient people, these would have seemed like 2 separate supernatural punishments. But from an ecological perspective, they might simply represent different stages of the same outbreak. Gnats and biting insects often breed in damp soil, stagnant water, or decaying organic matter. If the Nile ecosystem had been disrupted and amphibians were dying across the land, insect populations would likely rise very quickly. And once insects begin multiplying, they bring another problem with them: disease. Many insects are vectors for bacteria and parasites. They can carry pathogens from animal carcasses to livestock, crops, and humans. Modern epidemiology has shown how quickly insect-borne diseases can spread in environments where sanitation breaks down. Ancient Egypt would have been especially vulnerable. The Nile Valley was densely populated. People lived close to their animals. Water sources were shared by humans, livestock, and wildlife. If insects carrying bacteria suddenly became widespread, outbreaks of disease could follow. The biblical sequence actually reflects this possibility quite closely. After the swarms of insects come plagues affecting livestock. Then painful boils appear among humans and animals. To modern scientists, that progression looks less like separate supernatural events and more like a cascade of biological consequences. First insects spread, then infections spread. And once disease begins moving through animal populations, the entire agricultural system starts to suffer. Livestock provide milk, meat, transportation, and farming power. If animals begin dying in large numbers, food production collapses. And that kind of collapse can quickly turn environmental disruption into a full-scale societal crisis. To ancient Egyptians watching these events unfold, the situation would have seemed terrifying because the disasters were not stopping. Each problem seemed to trigger another one, and the next stage of the plagues would make the situation even worse. Because now the diseases begin killing the animals that Egypt depended on most. After the swarms of insects come one of the most economically devastating plagues described in Exodus, the death of livestock. According to the biblical account, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats across Egypt begin dying in large numbers. For an ancient agricultural society, this would have been more than a tragedy. It would have been a disaster for the entire economy. Livestock were not just food in ancient Egypt. They were transportation, farming equipment, fertilizer, milk production, leather, wool, and wealth, all wrapped into one very useful animal. So when the Bible describes livestock dying across the land, historians immediately start wondering what kind of disease might cause something like that. And once again, the previous plagues may offer a clue. If insect populations exploded because of decaying animals and environmental disruption, those insects could easily spread bacteria and viruses between animals. Modern veterinary science shows that insect-borne diseases can spread rapidly through herds. One possible candidate often mentioned is anthrax. Anthrax bacteria live in soil and can infect grazing animals such as cattle and sheep. Insects that feed on infected animals can carry the bacteria to other livestock, spreading the disease quickly. Anthrax infections can kill animals very suddenly, sometimes within a day or two. To ancient observers, this would look terrifyingly mysterious. Healthy animals would suddenly collapse and die with little warning. And once large numbers of livestock begin dying, the consequences ripple. This plague seems different from the previous ones. Turning water red, frogs fleeing the river, insect swarms, livestock disease. Those events can all be connected through environmental chain reactions. But boils, that sounds more like a medical mystery. However, when scientists look at ecosystems under stress, the appearance of skin diseases actually fits surprisingly well into the pattern we've already been discussing. Because when insect populations explode and animal diseases spread, humans often become the next victims. Insects such as flies, mosquitoes, and biting gnats are extremely effective carriers of bacteria. They feed on infected animals and then move to new hosts, spreading pathogens from one organism to another. If Egypt had been dealing with massive insect swarms following widespread animal deaths, the conditions would have been perfect for infectious disease outbreaks. Some researchers have suggested that illnesses like anthrax, glanders, or other bacterial infections could produce symptoms similar to the boils described in Exodus. Anthrax, for example, can cause severe skin lesions in humans known as cutaneous anthrax. These infections begin as small sores, but can quickly become painful blackened.